With thousands of hopes, Suez waited 3 years to meet his girlfriend Katrina. Today it is the 2nd of January 1942. Even though he tried to meet his girlfriend Katrina from mid-1939, he failed miserably. Suez, who has been on duty for 3 consecutive years, with the warm feeling of being able to go home on next vacation, is now exhausted. But his hopes do not seem to have been dashed. His best friend Paul is also with him. This is World War II. In the middle of it all, Suez and Paul, who continue to fight for their country, are 2 soldiers who shrug off their personal lives during their military services. Reading the letters received whenever they are roamed during the war enables them to fight on the front with Nevigo. There is a bundle of letters in one pocket of Suez's coat of arms, and 3 and 4 times as many letters in his suitcase. That's a red bundle of letters. All those letters were sent by Katrina. Suez picked up one from the stack of unread letters while they were resting amid the gunfire. The letter he has in his hand was written 9 months ago by Katrina. After this, there are 13 more to read. He reads them in the order in which they are received, with the maximum pleasure of the romantic enjoyment in the world of thoughts that arise when he links to the corresponding letter to the letters he sent. Katrina made sure not write any of her sad stories in the letters. She always made sure not to test her boyfriend's courage on the battlefield. She is adept at documenting how to ease her boyfriend's stressed mind over the beauty that will be when he comes to visit her on vacation. As to the command, he put the half-read letter in his pocket and obeyed the order to retreat with the firearm in his hand. The enemies launched a vicious attack. His friend Paul came running and said,
"Let's run this way. The numbers of enemies is high and many of us are wounded. I have no idea how many died. Is it too late to hear the retreat?"
Saying, Suez jumped over a trunk of a fallen tree across the road. Suddenly, a hail of bullets fell on the trunk. Even though Suez was safe, Paul is unsafe. Paul could not jump over the trunk. Suez realized that more than hundreds of enemies had surrounded him and Paul. He pointed to his friend and retreated very fast into the middle of the huge forest. The 2 of them ran through trees, vines, and bushes without looking back. Eventually, realizing that the enemy armies were not behind them, they stopped and rested. They know nothing but that they are in middle of a big forest.
"Which direction should we go?"
Suez asked Paul because he has a better understanding of direction than he did. Paul is silent. He also seems to have no idea. They have water and food only for another night. They hid sharply in a nearby bush in order to get some clue if the enemy came. It is about 3 o'clock in the evening. For 3 hours, they lay as they were, with no trace of enemy. They remained there until 9 p.m. They were startled by a distant voice. It was a team of enemies. With no hesitation or fear, they make their way to the hillside, about 30 yards from Suez and Paul, with a group of about 30 people.
"We are in the enemy's line,"
Paul murmured to Suez. It was a decision made by observing how the enemy forces were moving without any fear or suspicion. Suez and Paul were there as the darkness came, and to reduce the risk of making eye contact with the enemy troops. Staying in the same position until dawn the next day, exchanging sleep with each other, they put security at first. The two began their journey just as the light fell on the environment. Unaware of the directions, they drove unnoticed, and after about 3 hours of walking, suddenly Paul gestured his hand to Suez, asking him to stop.
Suez, there are footprints here.
Paul murmured. They paused for a moment and listened to the surrounding. Slowly, they left the footprints and discussed to hide in the forest so that no one could identify them. Their watch convinced them that they have stayed there for 2 hours and 30 minutes. Suez slowly pulled the half-read letter out of his pocket. He began to read the rest of it. Katrina is looking forward to meet him in the next vacation. She wrote the details of her beautiful village in a magical way. That was enough to send Suez into the village through his mind. For a moment, he walked around the village with Katrina. After hearing about his and Katrina's meeting, Paul came to meet the two. Paul secretly speaks to Suez.
Why are you talking secretly?
Katrina asks Paul. Suez looks at Paul.
Suez, someone is coming this way from far.
Paul says.
We didn't come secretly, so let them come.
Suez says, holding Katrina's hand.
Hey, get up!
Secretly but firmly, Paul pushed Suez in the cheek. Suez came to his senses with the letter in his hand.
Watch out! Someone is coming from a distance.
Paul groaned angrily. Suez immediately put the letter to the pile of red letters and listened intently to the surrounding. A voice speaking to a group of people in the distance. It was as if that voice was slowly approaching them. They both stayed still as they watched for a group of enemies or friends. From moment to moment, the voice gets closer. They are enemies. Suez signaled to Paul. That is because they can hear the language they speak now. The sound of footsteps can be heard very closely. Enemies are approaching them. But it was not from the direction that Paul or Suez hoped. The enemies are approaching them from behind. One came and stopped just near the bush where they were hiding. They are like pieces of wood lying quietly under the bush. They stand motionless about 2 feet behind them, unmoved, not even trying to look up. They are disguised as part of the environment by leaves and twigs, so not even a single animal can recognize them. The enemy soldier, who had been patrolling for about 5 minutes, signaled and proceeded. About a minute later, Paul counted about 70 soldiers one after another. Suez and Paul saw the bags that might contain food hanging around their shoulders and felt very hungry as they haven't had few meals. They remained in the same position for more than 30 minutes after the departure of the enemy, and then slowly came out of the bush.
Let's go where they came from. Maybe we can find a village boundary.
Suez told Paul. Paul paused for a moment and then approved. Both of them slowly moved forward. They were not tired, but it was clear that they were hungry. As they walked through the forest for about 20 miles, they heard the voice of small children, refreshing as if revived. Paul and Suez immediately searched for a suitable place to hide. Paul hid in a bush while Suez was hiding behind a decaying tree lying on the ground. Realizing that the children's voices could be heard, but not coming in their own direction. The two of them got out of their hiding places and slowly pulled towards the sound. About 200 yards away, Suez and Paul saw a small river and village at the end of the forest, and children running and playing on its banks. Lying on the ground so as not catch anyone's eye, they observed the end of the forest and beginning of a small village. After days of sleepless nights in the middle of a fierce war and starving for miles in the middle of the forest, Suez and Paul felt a sense of relief as they watched the little children play. They both hid from the children and studied the activities of the village. They observed that there were no enemy military activities there, and that this was an isolated small village. They both concluded that all the youth here could be active as enemy soldiers, as the children, women and adults were the only visible people in the village. They remained there until nightfall and walked slowly through the thick darkness to the lightened village. They softly entered to the village and inspected the leftover in the kitchens and gave priority to satisfy hunger. With a few snacks in their bags that might help them to satisfy their hunger, they slowly made their way out of the village without making any sound. But a dog that was outside did not allow them to hide from him. Suez saw that the dog snorted and coming towards them. At the same time, someone with a torchlight in his hand began to examine why the dog was barking. Suez threw the piece of bread in his hand at the dog. The dog's barking stopped when he smelled the bread. The villager carrying the torch was unable to locate the dog. That's because its barking didn't come. With that permission, Suez and Paul crept into the woods. They managed to spend the night among the trees and bushes nearby the village. Both of them ate what could not be preserved from the food in their hand. Satisfied with the food they received in few days, they fell asleep on the spot. Paul often wake up and worry of the risks. Suez is fast asleep. He fell into the dreamland with his girlfriend Katrina. He went to the village. Katrina waited for him to arrive. Both of them talked leisurely, feeling the love towards each other.
I have to go to work now, Katrina.
Suez told Katrina. Katrina emotionally touched his hand sadly. Her hand was warm. It is what he hoped for. He looked at his hand holding Katrina. Suddenly, Katrina slipped and fell. He gasped and tried to catch her. At the moment, he woke up, but he still felt the warmth of Katrina's hand. He slowly opened his eyes. The sun is shining. A dog licks his left hand as if his face is in his hands. He was shocked but immediately overwhelmed with joy as he had an overwhelming love for dogs. He looked at Paul. He is fast asleep. Suez looked around. A young woman was there with a gun pointed at him. A few yards behind were two small children. Suez immediately raised his hands. The young woman's face showed no fear or apprehension. Her face shows the heroism of a well-trained soldier. She says something, but neither Suez or Paul understands that language. They tell her that there is no harm from them. She doesn't understand either. Eventually, she took the firearm aside and left the place and headed towards the village. Suez and Paul felt they were in danger, but stared at the woman in horror. Paul and Suez, who had been looking at the woman until she went far away, immediately got up and went to another place, where were waiting for an enemy army to come to them at any upcoming moment. It was a decision made by thinking of the woman going the village and making them aware of them. About an hour later, Suez saw the dog coming back to where they were sleeping and pointed it out to Paul. Paul nodded and ordered him to look behind it. Suez looked behind and saw the woman coming back. She came to the place they had come and looked around. She didn't have the firearm in her hand. There is a parcel. She looked around and looked for Suez and Paul. Eventually, she left the parcel she had in her hands on a tree fork and left. Suez and Paul hid where they were about an hour before she left. Then, as there was no risk, Suez went to take the parcel and see what it is. It's food. Their breakfast was full of it. They were satisfied with the meal until the night. The woman returned in the evening and did not inquire about Suez and Paul that were hiding. She went straight to the tree fork she had left the parcel earlier. Knowing that the parcel she had left was not there, she took the new one and left it there. Seeing her go back to the village without any fear or hesitation, Suez immediately went and picked up the parcel. He picked it up and looked back at the direction where woman went. Suez saw that the woman was looking at him. She waited for a moment and then walked back to the village. Now, Suez and Paul have no fear of food, but there is no shortage of suspicion. They both ate as they watched the woman return to the village. They both ate thoughtfully, without saying anything. A new fiction for Suez and Paul to discuss. That is whether they leave this place and travel further or to stay in this area until they join their forces. The discussion was not cordial enough to the two to come to the same conclusion. Suez suggested staying at this area and Paul suggested leaving this place and moving on. However, Suez had to agree with Paul's idea, that is to go ahead and join their army somehow. But Paul agreed to Suez's proposal to start the journey in the next morning. They were not allowed to speak for long and voices could be heard in the distance through the forest, in their own language. Paul and Suez heard a shouting.
If anyone is lost, raise your voice!
Suez was overjoyed to hear his colleague's voice that had come from them and tried to shout, which was immediately stopped by Paul by covering his mouth with his hand.
Listen well. Even in our language, this can be a trap. Let's hide.
The two immediately went into hiding. About 5 minutes later, about 25 armed men came through the jungle to their hiding place. Paul is right. 6 of their elite soldiers hand-tied behind them. One of the 6 yells at the signal given by the enemy army with guns behind them. It is a trap. Everyone knows that its victims are objected to torture, which is worse than death. It was the way of enemies. The maintenance of prisoners of war is carried out arbitrarily without any policy. Suez looks at his 6 allied soldiers with great sadness. In the moment, the enemy soldiers saw Suez and Paul's footprints, showed them to everyone and exchanged words in their language. Again, one of the 6 shouts for lost soldiers according to the enemy's command. The houses located adjacent to each other in the village are the scene where Suez is hidden. Suddenly, the young woman with her 2 children comes towards the forest. She also had an axe in her hand. In few minutes, she arrived at the beginning of the forest. When the enemy army saw her coming from distance, they immediately hid themselves. One was hiding near where Paul was hiding. The young woman came and set her children on a small rock and began to cut a small tree. She went about her work without any fear or apprehension. Suez stares at her from where he was hiding, surprised and curious. Within minutes, an enemy army officer emerged from the jungle and spoke to her. She looks at him in a shock, then at her children and at the village. The enemy slowly approached her. A conversation between her and the enemy officer. It took about 3 minutes. The officer then showed her the footprints of Suez and Paul's. Paul and Suez now understand the meaning of this exchange. The woman smiled and pointed to her pair of shoes and pointed to the footprints and said something. The officer examined her shoes thoroughly and looked at the footprints on the ground. Paul was amazed to see that the woman was wearing a pair of military shoes, instead of the woman's shoes she had been wearing on the previous occasion. Paul was surprised and embarrassed when he saw the woman quickly turns to help him and Suez. That is by remembering all the healing arguments to leave this place without trusting this woman. Moments later, the officer ordered 6 of his soldiers to march towards the village. The officer placed the children under the protection of the 2 soldiers and lit a cigarette. About an hour later, the 6 enemy troops returned from the village and exchanged views with the officer. A few minutes later, they all headed back to the forest. The woman began to cut down the tree as if nothing had happened. She threw it on the ground and cut it into pieces of the same length. It took her at least 2 hours. The 2 children were playing. Eventually, she piled the firewood well and went back towards the village with her children. Suez and Paul decided to stay quiet in the hiding place. Their decision was right. Just as the woman was entering the village, an enemy soldier came out of the jungle and approached the pile of woods. He gestured to his other comrades who were hiding to come out. They might have come to a decision. They must have discussed that there was no doubt about her. They all went to the forest back, communicating with each other. Suez gestured to Paul with an eye and told him to be quiet. The 2 of them hid unmoved until nightfall and dawn the next day. While they were doing so, they marveled at the woman's wisdom. She didn't bring dinner. She didn't bring the breakfast either. Every time Paul looks at Suez, he signals him to be still. At about 10 in the morning, the woman returned with her 2 children. Without any searching, she tied a bundle of wood, took it to the village. The 2 children followed her shouting. About 10 minutes later, an enemy soldier jumped from a tree near the place where Paul was hiding and headed to the forest. About half an hour after he left, Suez came out of his hiding place. Paul also joined him. Suez told Paul that he had seen the spy and had therefore signaled to hide. Paul and Suez have not had food or water since breakfast the day before. They immediately drank as much as water as they had taken from the water bottles. As the evening wore on, the young woman returned with a large bag. She shared the meal equally between the two. While Paul and Suez were eating, the young woman threw the men's clothes she had brought over and told them to put them on in her own language. Realizing what she said through her signals, Paul and Suez changed them and tried to hide their military uniforms. The woman took the clothes and put them in the bag. Afterwards, she took some pieces of wood and started to walk towards the village, telling them to take a pile of woods as well and to follow. Suez and Paul followed her. As they approached the village elders, women, and children stared at them. The woman said something to everyone. They nodded and smiled friendly at Suez and Paul. As they approached the center of the village, an older man approached them, signaled them to put the wood on the floor and to enter a small shed. Suez and Paul silently entered. At the entrance, it looked like a wood shed with two beds that are neat and tidy. The old man greeted them with a friendly smile and motioned for them to sit. Suez and Paul lied on the bed, unable to think of anything. After a while, a few children came and looked at them. A moment later, an older man arrived and sent the children away. Dinner was served hot and Suez remembered his girlfriend Katrina. When he went to the village on the vacation, he remembered the taste of the food that Katrina cooked. However, the joy of the taste of the food was overwhelming to them, as they never had a warm meal during the war, and that made them think that the villagers are no strangers anymore. They did not know their language but were able to have a good conversation, adding the hand language as well. After about 5 days, Suez and Paul learned the language enough to have a significant conversation with the children and adults. About 10 days later, the two of them spent the same amount of time walking and mastering the language as members as the village. Their time was spent with good food, freedom, and welcome. The young lady who gave them all this to them is well received by all in this village. She cleverly defended these two soldiers who were her enemies. Suez and Paul talked to her about her positional wisdom, expressed their surprise and gratitude. One fine night, Suez finished reading the last letter sent by his girlfriend Katrina. It was very painful for him not to get another fresh letter from her again. Paul had no idea about that. He spoke to the young lady one evening and asked,
Is it too far from here to the side where our army is?
She smiled.
As far as man could die.
She said ironically that the enemy troops cannot be avoided.
We'll try. Anyway.
As Paul said to her. She said, looking at Paul and Suez,
Your troops are now in your country. Now there are only 2 of your troops in this country. Both of them are not active.
What she is saying is that all our forces have been defeated by the enemy troops about a year past. Now Paul and Suez handle the language as well as the people of that country. They now have almost no idea of returning to their home country. They cultivate, participate in other activities as well. Also does animal husbandry. They played in the river, ate hot food. The villagers keep these two happy without any shortcomings. They have no risk or suspicion at all. The villagers do not even remember that they were once visitors. Everyone is having a happy time. When an idea of the thought of a leader of a country leads to war and the life of the people who are squeezed out of it, and hostile armies does in hundreds and thousands, the responsible leader will surely live a happy life. Against such a backdrop, the war took place thousands of miles beyond the birth of two friendly members in one corner, and thousands of miles passed in the face of the war, and the rest of their lives passed by chance as given by God. Suez spends a life between happiness and sadness. It is between the comfortable life he got and the grief felt when he remembered Katrina. Paul has no new feelings. He lives a normal life. 3.5 years have now passed. The lives of Suez and Paul go on beautifully. Suddenly, the young lady called Suez and Paul and said,
Good news! You can go to your village. Your country has sent an agent for the lost people in your country. I informed them about you too. I was sent a letter saying that they will be here tomorrow.
It was great news to Suez and Paul, but in a moment it caused them great sorrow. Tomorrow has set for end the happy life with the villagers that have been growing for 3.5 years. The pleasure of having nutrition food and the great relationship with the children, adults and youngsters. In early days, their only hope was to be home. But by this time, it has become very difficult to leave the villages. That night was made up of beautiful dreams and sad stories. Suez met Katrina in his dreams. Tomorrow will be the day the survivors to surrender themselves to their own people. They wished it be enlightened. The next day came. It was not even 2 hours after sunrise. Representatives from Suez and Paul's country came. They checked the identity of Suez and Paul. The young lady brought the military uniforms of Suez and Paul. It confirmed their identity. Suez and Paul stared at her in amazement. She had been looking forward to this opportunity on the very first day we met. Paul and Suez had no idea how to be grateful to her. Suez and Paul greeted all the villagers as far as they know. With all their might, including this woman who took good care of them. After saying goodbye to them, they got into the vehicle as instructed by the agents and did not take their eyes off the village until the village disappeared. Everyone, especially the little ones, shook their hands until they disappeared. If the end of those involved in a brutal war in all 3 worlds was so emotional, it would only be Suez and Paul. Postscript. I studied about the prisoners of war on my study purpose. There I saw a photograph of 2 soldiers who had been captured by the Nazi army. It is a photograph taken at the moment of their release by the Allied forces after 3.5 years of brutal torture and imprisonment. Here you see them. I was shocked to see these Russian soldiers who had been malnourished for 3.5 years without food. This is my attempt to deceive my mind, thinking of how nice it would be if their lives have been according to my own story. So I named one as Suez and the other as Paul, thinking that my story would bring peace to their souls.